keeping track of what the CIA and the Defense Department have been doing for a long time as far as using us as guinea pigs for mind control and other types of horrible things they have in mind.
This is from secret CIA and U.S. Army biological warfare testing on Americans, MK Ultra, aerial spraying of cities.
On their own men to discover if they could get rid of agents who were going to quit the department and still had classified information. So they utilized different types of drugs and pain and hypnosis and electric shock to try and get the guys to forget. Then they also did experimentations to using different chemicals to see if you can induce a person to commit a crime or induce him to do that or to do this. Of course, the CIA claimed that it didn't carry it through. The documentation we got was actually that they did that. Then we came across the overall project called MK Ultra. Its earlier code name was Artichoke, and that included 149 sub-projects. Yeah. And those sub-projects range from what I just described to open-air testing in the United States, experimentation on prisoners, experimentation on soldiers, experimentation on college students.
Would these people know they were being experimented on and gave their approval?
No, except for the quote-unquote voluntary Army soldiers.
Oh, yeah.
And the way the voluntary Army program worked is it started in 1959, and the guys were just told that they would be doing experimentation on new weapons, right? And then they get to Fort Detrick, Maryland, where the experimentation was done, and find out that they were going to be doing it on drugs and chemicals. But they were never told what they would be experimented on. You know, they just knew that they went crazy for a couple of days or so forth and so on, and then years later have similar things to the guys who had Agent Orange, because there's one chemical that was used called VZ, and it's 100 times stronger than LSD. It's a very gross drug that causes a person to totally go out of his head for at least 12 hours, sometimes up to 2 to 3 weeks, where he doesn't even know where he is or who he is.
Are there residual effects to BZ?
Yes. Now, the Army at first said that they'd done testing to discover it, and they said there weren't any residual results.
It's harmless. They always say that.
Right. And we did a campaign to find the soldiers who had been experimented on, and we found approximately 40 in the U.S., all of which have been experiencing extreme emotional and physical upset since that time. You know, with children with birth defects, the same sort of thing as Agent Orange. But the Army, as part of the CIA's experimentations, wanted to simulate chemical biological warfare attacks and to see what effect it would have on different Americans, how far it could go in, and so forth, and also test to see how they could use it on other countries.
Senator Paul's passion. He's been doing this for 6 years. I think he's been wrong for 6 years. And let me just say something. There's a reason I'm not talking about eye surgery on the floor. I don't know anything about it.
You don't believe in the Bill of Rights. Rand Paul destroys Lindsey Graham and heated Senate debate.
You're fighting a crime. I'm fighting a war.
Lindsey Graham,
if we're up to Senator Paul, there'd be no difference between a criminal and a warrior. Radical Islam, in the form of ISIS, they're not trying to steal your car or break in your house. They're trying to destroy your way of life. So if you believe we're at war like I do, we should apply the law of war.
Their phantom cells
for 33 years, I was a military lawyer,
ordered by Lindsey
prosecutor,
Graham and
defense
others,
attorney, and a military judge. I think I know the difference between fighting a crime and fighting a war.
Americans.
When it comes to fighting a war, if you capture somebody who's part of the enemy force, Senator Paul, the last thing we worry about is how to try them. We want to hold them under the law of war to gather intelligence, to make sure we understand what this person knows about enemy operations. We had 450,000 German and Japanese prisoners in the United States. Guess what? Not one of them had a lawyer. If you had said what he just said in World War II, they'd run you out of town. Most Americans would find it odd that a Japanese and German prisoner of war would be entitled to a lawyer under the Bill of Rights, because they're not. We're fighting a war, and I'd like to win the war sooner rather than later. When it comes to killing the enemy, that's part of war. But if you're lucky enough, clever enough to capture one of these bad guys, the last thing I want them to hear is you have a right to a lawyer. You don't. Under military law, no enemy prisoner has a right to a lawyer.
Many of
You're talking
the
about fighting a
captured
crime.
in the War
I'm
on
talking
Terror
about
were
fighting
found
a
innocent.
war. There are 44 people in Gitmo that have been held for over a decade that will never see the light of day because they're part of the enemy force. They've had due process under the law of war, and they're too dangerous to let go. They're not going to be tried in federal court. They're not going to be tried by military commission because they're too dangerous to let go, and we have no interest in a trial. We have an interest in keeping them off the battlefield. They will die in jail without a trial. That's what happens when you join Al-Qaeda or ISIS. You can get killed or you can die in jail. So if you're an American citizen thinking about joining ISIS, don't.
Over the terrorists in the Middle
You're
East.
not going to be captured because the color of your skin or your religion or your political views. You'll be captured because you've turned on your own country. In every war we've ever had, American citizens have unfortunately sided with the enemy.
Are conducting
Guess what
hate crimes
ISIS
against
is
the
trying
United
to do
States
as I
public.
speak? Recruit people in their own backyard.
They are
How
the
many
terrorists.
people have bought the propaganda over the internet? The two guys in Boston, one of them had permanent status. They bought into this crazy construct that you got to kill everybody in the name of religion. The guy who ran over the folks in New York. All these people have one thing in common. They were radicalized by the enemy. They became soldiers of the caliphate. So here's what I'm trying to say. It's not my view of the Constitution that I want you to look at. It's what the Supreme Court has said. In Ex parte Curran, a 1942 case, it involved capturing German saboteurs in Long Island. Now, the last time I checked, Long Island, New York is part of the United States. You had American citizens collaborating with the enemy. They were captured as a group. The American citizens were tried by military commission, and one of them was executed.
Which allows
Why?
them to conceal.
Because under the law of war, once you join the enemy, your American citizenship doesn't protect you from the consequence of your act. N. Ray Curran said, citizenship in the United States of an enemy belligerent does not relieve him of the consequences of belligerency, which is unlawful because it is in violation of law of war. In 2009, an American citizen captured in Afghanistan
They're engaged
fighting
in
for the
war
Taliban.
crimes against the American
There is
public
no
and
bar
others.
to this nation's holding
They have declared
one
war
of its own
on the
citizens
consent
as
of the
enemy
government,
combatant.
which is the American
For
Republic.
those who understand the law of war, this is one of the timeless concepts. He's trying to turn the war into a crime. Now, I agree with Senator Paul. If you're charged with a crime, you can't be held indefinitely and questioned without legal representation because you're being accused of a crime and you have rights as a criminal defendant. When you
which
become
they're
an enemy
seeking to
combatant,
systematically remove.
you have rights under the law of war, and there is no right for an enemy prisoner to be given a lawyer.
They do not follow those rules.
I object.
David is held as
Now, I
a
have so
general
much more to offer, but I object.
without the respect
Objection is heard. Mr. President, Senator from Kentucky.
his office from their
I think it's important
courts.
to listen to what you heard and analyze what you heard because apparently
those
if you're
privileges,
defined as an enemy combatant, it would be okay not to have a trial, not to have a
they
lawyer,
have not
and you
performed
wouldn't be
that
presumed
function.
innocent, you would be presumed guilty. But the question you have to ask is who gets to define the enemy combatant? So if the government gets to define you as an enemy combatant, is it not conceivable that you could be an enemy combatant because you are a minority, either of skin color or of ideology? Has it happened in the past? The Japanese citizens were minority, but there was no evidence. No one presented any evidence that they were a threat or had done anything wrong. The Non-Detention Act attempted to fix this. There were people like this back in the time of World War II. There are people like this in every war who are frightened of those who would attack us, so they want to give up a constitution to make it simpler
They're not
to get
scared.
to guilt.
They're
You don't
traitors.
have to have a trial. You just proclaim people
They hate
guilty. If
America,
you proclaim someone an
and they're
enemy
dismantling
combatant,
its
there will be
security.
no trial. But it begs the question, who gets to decide? Are you going to let one person decide, or are we going to have a jury? Imagine
Economic
how
terrorism by
important this is to
economic
our
hitmen.
country. We should be alarmed that there are people trying to prevent a trial by jury in our country. It hadn't been
Subcontractors
used so far, thankfully. We
under
have
the
actually
KKK,
386 times taken terrible, awful,
dismantling
rotten people who tried to attack us.
stable
We
free
tried them
society
in courts with juries. We
under
presumed
Lindsey
they were
Graham's order.
innocent. We found them guilty and we punished them.
They
See,
are
the
the
problem
threat.
isn't about how terrible terrorists are or terrorism is. Murders are equally as bad. I mean, we had somebody go in a nightclub in Orlando and kill 125 people. He's as evil as any terrorist we've got out there,
Agreed.
yet he will get a trial. Not because anybody condones what he does, not because anybody doesn't want to punish him. We give him a trial because it's part of who we are. It's part of America to have trials. You short-circuit America. You short-circuit American history. If you
Dismantling
get
checks
rid
and
of a trial
balances.
by jury, if you get rid of presumption of innocence, it doesn't mean you have any sympathy for the guilty.
Is an
But we've
attack
got to
on
make
the
sure we
government,
get the guilty. We
which is
can't just
defined
sort
by
of
those checks and
prosecute people
balances.
because they have brown skin, because they have black skin, because we don't like the way they act, or we don't like their religion. That's what comes of a country that doesn't have trials. Look around the world. There are countries that don't have trials. That's not who we are. We cannot be so frightened of terrorism that we are going to presume guilt and have no trials. It will
I'm
end
so
up
scared
in
I'm
tyranny.
going to destroy myself.
And so I
Said
ask
no
again
one.
and again, and I won't ask it now because he's left, but I ask again and again, will this body not allow a vote?
They are
This
committing
isn't
treason,
even about him voting
sedition,
no.
and
It's
high
about him
crimes.
objecting to even the democratic process of
They
the
are at
Senate
war with the
allowing
American
a
government.
vote. So America needs to know there is one opponent in the Senate who does not believe in the Bill of Rights. When he declares you an enemy combatant, you don't get the Fifth or Sixth Amendment. That's what this is about, and I'm happy if he wants to go home and defend that, but this is a very important debate and should not end here. Thank you.
Confederates are not Americans, and they are at war with the Americans. They're using this for espionage war to overthrow the government and its elected functions, at which point you have the systematic acts of treason, sedition, and high crimes as a status quo function of their existence. War is a racket, and they are a parasite, eating the American wealth and power, leaving us utterly defenseless, crippling our economy, crippling our society, crippling our military. These attacks against the United States by the Confederacy is systematic threats to national security which must be retaliated against by functions of the court conducting lawful orders of law enforcement. Confederates and Confederates who are referring to themselves under the interest of subverting the Constitution, such as George W. Bush, said that they don't. Who's going to enforce the Constitution if the executive is the one doing it? And the answer is the American government. That is why they're at war with the American government, to stop checks and balances from being enforced against Confederate interests for the exponential extortions and frauds against the American public, such as the systematic failure of them in the Pentagon and others to lose trillions upon trillions, time after time after time, for the systematic enrichments of Confederacy in their wars against the world.
Really, you jerk off think that's what we do? That's what we're going to do in these countries.
Defense contractors benefited from nearly half of the $14 trillion spent for Afghan war. Historically, it's been considered a faux pas to question the military arm of our government. It was considered akin to disgracing the everyday soldier, sailor, airman, and marine. Really, it's been considered by whom? It's been considered a little more than a faux pas. This is a standard attack used by the establishment of both parties and their mouthpieces in the corporate press to smear the left almost exclusively. Okay, just the botched withdrawal of Afghanistan has finally stirred some in the media, government, and regular population to start questioning the motivations and credibility of the military brass and civilian leaders charged with supporting and defending our great Constitution. Who are the actual beneficiaries of the Pentagon's gross financial negligence? One merely has to look at the military-industrial complex to see who is supported. Take the Pentagon's endeavor to increase shipbuilding production. They estimate the program to cost $27 billion annually between 2023 and 2052. However, the Congressional Budget Office says that the estimate is off by $120 billion. The process is important for us to do, and it is making us get better. It is not making us get better as fast as we want, meaning audits. The speed is exactly where you want it to be. And let's remember what Julian Assange said.
The goal is not to completely subjugate Afghanistan. The goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the United States, out of the tax bases of European countries, through Afghanistan, and back into the hands of a transnational security event. That is the goal, i.e. the goal is to have an endless war, not a successful war.
Sounds like a mafia running Vegas.
Yeah.
The skim.
That's
It's
a
the
scam. That's a scam. That's 100% mafia scam. Our country is a mafia, run by mafia. We are a mafia country.
Sometimes they collaborate with the mafia to
with
do
the
more
ma-
mafia things.
That's
And
right.
the KKK.
Like kill Kennedy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, don't spoil it. 60 years before.
Don't spoil it.
That was the Pentagon lost $2 trillion again on the Jimmy Dore show. At which point you have to understand the systematic arrangements of their war against the United States by criminal terrorism and encroachment, by the blocking of remedies, by terrorism and ex post facto, of criminal functions specifically subversive of the American Constitution, under the specific arrangements to engage in the eradication of American security for the Confederate arrangements, at which point we have to systematically apply functions such as releasing the data for the duel in order to engage in the court actions in order to compel the enforcement of the law against the double agents who, seeking the destruction of the United States, need, by definition, to have triggered law enforcement and national security actions against them, such as their blocking of the terrorism torturing children, such as their torturing of infants, such as the qualifiers of their justification of the war on David, which attacked him since before birth on the basis of the estimate of his person without the obstruction in American law, and refuses to comply with communism. In that agreement, you do not have a right to economic hitmen. You don't have a right to non-due process injuries to person, property, or effects, at which point you have the systematic erosion of the United States precedents as they collaborate in the erosion of your rights and your securities. They build precedents and protocols and justifications of saying that you can't get a remedy, including the fact that the remedy that had been happening before was slightly different than the thing happening now, which is in function the same thing, would it be a direct fraud, which is normal to the arrangements in dismantling your reliance on the rule of law in favor of the nation of men under Confederacy. They used those types of policies, such as the war on David, in order to block David from engaging in the normal function of his title by the obstruction of his starting assets, which includes companies managed and operated by adults who are fully competent to do so, at which point those obstructions, being necessary to the function of society and national security, were taken up so that the American public would be too weak and thus incapable of engaging in the consent of the governed by majority under the rule of law. The constitutional barriers does not tolerate pure democracy. It is a service to law. The tyranny of the majority may not be tolerated. It must be blocked by the rule of law, and their dismantlement of these systems allows for a false majority generated by terrorism and voter fraud, giving the false arguments to their criminal abuses, covering for their KKK functions. the KKK getting into the government is discoverable history, at which point the removing of them from the government is necessary to national security, as they are engaged in using the office as a false cover for color of law and color of office, to the destruction of the definition of that office and the laws it is built to enforce and validate, at which point you do not have a consistent culture, as the culture is derived by the definition of that society, and that society is the nation of law, which is the definition of those laws, which are systematically being purged from the society, which is the system of genocide against the Americans by the hate crime function. Hoover was a homosexual who was aggressive and retaliatory against homosexuals, and he also arranged the systematic engagement of surveillance for espionage and extortion, having observed and united with many mafia functions, engages in the extortion of the politicians who were not in compliance with his false morality policies, which were entirely hypocritical, as homosexuality was a thing that Hoover and many of his supporters aggressively fought. You have the full irony of the subject, which increases the price of the product. The more force you invest against it, the higher the value of the product. The higher the investment, the higher the profits. At which point, the higher profits is derived by their obligation of being observed as separate to the rest of the society in a two-tiered system, in which case it must feel normal to them. At which point they need the irony of it being normal, and they need the irony of it not being normal in order to manufacture their alternative dark money resources, which generates their perpetual black markets, which is the function of creating false morality markets for the crime market, which generates their revenue as an alternative to the power of the purse from the legislators, which allows them to take legal functions of the legislator, ordering them to be ignored as an overstep of the legislator when it was in fact their original agreed upon authority, such as the attacks against the intelligence apparatus, as though the intelligence were superior to the Congress. If the superiority of the intelligence to the Congress is in fact enforceable, then there is no American government, at which point you have the intelligence agents such as Jeffrey Epstein, who, not having the released document, just engaged in the extortion mechanisms of American politicians and highly powerful members of the general society, such as the wealthy. At which point you have these systems of obstructed groups under these enforcement mechanisms who will not be released as criminal functions, such as the protection of the gymnast teacher for the Texas high school, who basically the government had to have its teeth pulled in order to get them to punish him at all. They have these kinds of malicious, corrupt protection rackets by their criminal permit system under Confederacy, which generates the obligation of loyalty to the Confederacy, because not being loyal to the Confederacy allows them to retaliate for the norms of the Confederacy, the normal activities and functions of the society of the Confederates being compromised. If they side with the Americans, can immediately have them punished, and thus their only protection against law enforcement is Confederacy. And the development of these systems, of this corruption, is destructive to the existence of all American societies, as it is not just an absence position of their incidentals, but an active malicious war through the espionage arrangements for their terrorist activities. They subcontractors are constantly hired in order to subvert the Constitution. The government saying that it doesn't have a right to do it gives false permission that it had no authority to give, rendered it to the subcontractors, such as the KKK, who actively enforce the agreement, allowing for the beyond law or legal functions, for the manipulation of the equipment, for the application of terrorism, such as the perpetual tortures and destructions of property, pursuant to the declaration of war against the people, at which point you have the systematic injury to the civilian population who was labeled an enemy and combatant for supporting American law, at which point you have treason, sedition, and high crimes confessed to in the act of the existence of those functions.